Hey everyone, it's Tom here, and today we're looking at the Firestorm mode of Battlefield 5. Now, this comes after a swathe of other Battle Royale games and modes, but actually, it works rather well. Overall, it fits in with Battlefield's remit from the start. It's always had this kind of sandbox style that's worked well with big arenas and lots of players. So for this mode, I thought we'd dig into every console version just to get the lowdown on what the resolutions are, how it's performing, and the visual differences between each. So first things first, obviously this isn't your standard Battlefield mode. There are a number of changes made to the setup just to get things into the mold of a Battle Royale. Obviously there's the restricting cone of play, which is signified by a large fire alpha transparency which circles the whole perimeter of this battlefield and draws it to the center as you'd expect. This is one of the cooler aspects, I think, because as you get to the climax of a game, you get to a point where everything's kind of covered in a heat haze post-effect. Another big difference from other Battle Royales is, of course, that DICE's Frostbite engine puts such a heavy emphasis on physics and destruction and vehicle play. The effect that Firestorm has on building as it recedes to a smaller point makes perfect use of the destruction physics. Every building crumbles, grass fizzles, and the whole thing just looks amazing as the chaos comes to one point. It's also worth noting this is only 64 players max right now, so much in line with the regular multiplayer mode in Battlefield. It seems like DICE's online infrastructure really was well geared towards that number, so that's what we've got. The one map we've got to play on here, called Holstoy, is to my mind the largest we've had in the Battlefield series, and it's divided into two parts. There's the wintry Arctic side, and then the more summery lush area. So with that said, let's dive in and see what each console is doing in turn. Let's go with the PS4 and PS4 Pro in a top-down comparison. Now, what I did to achieve this footage is obviously I ran the spectator mode while other players were playing, and it takes the same point of view, but each console is set up to render the scene in different ways. So native resolutions first. What we've got on PS4 Pro is a dynamic 4K, but as ever with the Frostbite engine, you've got a swathe of technologies running behind that to kind of manipulate the image, and there is reconstruction going on here. There's temporal anti-aliasing, and of course there is that dynamic component to the resolution. Factor in the motion blur and it's very difficult to parse exactly what's going on natively. But I did catch a few edges as the lower bounds, which was 2304 by 1296, but in general I found numbers higher than that, and overall the effect is of a 4K image, though with artifacting, especially on the Firestorm effects on the fringes of the map. So there are some drawbacks, but I did find the image holds up really surprisingly well. Now, compared to PS4, there is no contest really. The base PS4 essentially works much like the main game. You get a dynamic 1080p, it generally holds at the upper bounds of that, but I've seen numbers rest just above 900p, but typically it is closer to 1920 by 1080 most of the time. Now let's press on to the Xbox consoles. Native resolution wise, we're looking at a dynamic 4K again on Xbox One X. As you'd expect, the bottom range of that is much harder to catch, and I found numbers like 3456 by 1944 at worst. So really it's not a major drop off from the full 2160p there. Now obviously there may be more to it, and there's plenty more of the game to play, though in effect, again with the TAA, the reconstruction, the dynamic res, it's hard to really pick out a difference between that and PS4 Pro. But the difference against the base Xbox One is marked. It's absolutely night and day in terms of image quality. Now conceivably it's running at 720p to 1080p much like the rest of the game, but 1536 by 864 is the lowest I've seen so far, and that's tested running pixel counts as the player kind of skydives downwards and parachutes into an area with lots of geometry on show. This is one of many ways you can really stress the engine and throw as much on screen as possible on the base machine, and that's the lowest number I've seen. But in general, it's been around 900p to my testing so far. Now, what else? Base Xbox One versus X is my favourite comparison, just because it gives you the full spectrum of console performance in terms of what they're doing visually. With that in mind, the cloud coverage is a bit different between the two. It's completely randomized, so you'll have to factor that out as we go, but clearly there are differences between them besides res. Assets are pretty much identical between the two, and terrain and foliage draw distances are very similar too. Purely for the sake of gameplay balance, I think that had to be in place, otherwise one player could be hiding under grass which isn't rendered on the other, which reveals them, so that has to be rendered on both sides. So what DICE has done to mitigate the difference in power spec between the two machines is work on the shadows. We're getting a clearly lower preset for shadows on base Xbox One. And also there's the alpha effects on the edges of the map, the Firestorm. It is massively undercut in resolution. To my count, it's 50% of 1080p on base Xbox One, while X gets away with something much higher res. That is by far the biggest limitation on the base consoles in general. There's more pixelation, there's more artifacting, and it's a clear drawback for the base consoles, but if you're overlooking that, actually they do hold up rather well overall. It's just that by the end of the game, you're obviously going to see more of that effect as it encircles you, so it will stand out the further you get into a match. Now, let's look at the performance. What I've done here is run the game side by side with someone else in the office. We played simultaneously, basically one player shadowing the other as they run through the map. And if we're looking at the PlayStation consoles first, clearly base PS4 is lagging behind, but not substantially so. It's like 50 to 60 FPS most of the way. Most of the game is 60, but you will get drops to 50, while PS4 Pro seems to ride it out pretty much consistently at 60. So it's a really good turnout there, and there are a few reasons why this is the case. It's actually an improvement of what I saw in the general multiplayer for Battlefield 5, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, it's still 64 players max, but those 64 players are strewn across a much larger map, and as a result of that, the encounters are far less frequent. On top of that, vehicle play is restricted somewhat. You do have access to more passive vehicles, but the real heavy duty stuff, the tanks, which can really throw effects around the screen, are kind of locked behind gates, which take a bit of work to get to, and so they become a less regular fixture in the game overall. So with all that combined, you're going to see fewer drops and at lesser extremes as well compared to the regular multiplayer, where things are more variable and there'll be just simply more players on screen at once. So that is good news. Now, if we look at the Xbox consoles by comparison, it's much the same. X rides it out at a more or less flawless 60 FPS, a few stutters and hiccups here and there, mostly down to networking I imagine, and mainly right at the start as you skydive downwards, but outside of that, it's a really impressive showing. The problem is, as per usual, the base Xbox One, it's the S model here, and that's running at a lower frame rate than even the base PS4, where we had 50 to 60 FPS, this is now more like 45 to 60 FPS, with drops being far more frequent as well. Again, the feeling is the advantage is much more stark if you're running on an X, and when one console's running at 3/4 of the frame rate of the other, it's hardly a fair competition when you're on a 1v1. So it's a bit unfortunate, but it's actually par for course. I think it falls in line with my expectations going into this. And again, it's more evidence that the Frostbite engine is really well tailored to the enhanced consoles, the Pro and X, while the base machines are kind of falling behind. You can get away with a good passable performance on base PS4. I was quite happily playing that, and given it's running at the resolutions it's running at, it's actually not a bad way to go. But with the base Xbox One, yeah, this is starting to lag behind, and it's a bit of a shame. Taken as a whole, the Firestorm mode on console has turned out rather well, I think. There have been a few glitches here and there. A couple of players in my playthroughs have ended up in the T-pose pretty much indefinitely across the game, which has been pretty amusing. There have been a few glitches here and there, but besides that, nothing game-breaking. Fundamentally, this is a really well-made Battle Royale. The only downside I'd say is the fact you do have to own Battlefield 5, which isn't a given with the latest crop of games. Apex Legends and Fortnite seem to be thriving on this free-to-play model, so you've got a hurdle to jump there to actually try it out first. But still, it's a great addition. After all, it had the strong groundwork laid out with the engine and the online infrastructure DICE has already in place, and I think of all the games jumping on the bandwagon here, the Battlefield series felt like the most apt for it. Still, that's all I have for today on the console side. If you did find this useful or interesting in any way, please let me know with a like or subscribe, and be sure to hit the bell to get notifications as any video lands. To get the source file to this, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in contact with me or the team, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.